It's nice to meet all of you. And as I was hearing you pose all your questions to Sarah, it was, I mean, quite an experience for me. Essentially, it took me back to a time where, so I was a budding researcher at the Department of Plant Molecular Biology in Delhi University. And I kept trying to explain what I did for a living to my parents, and they could not seem to understand it. And I don't know. I'm going to put this question out to the audience themselves, as to how many of you have struggled to communicate your science or communicate what you do to just anybody in your inner circle who is not part of your lab. This is something that quite a few of you must, of course, struggle with quite regularly, right? So that's essentially what I'm here to talk to you folks about, in terms of what is happening in the sphere of research communication, especially to the media, what publishers are doing, and what I've been seeing for close to 2 years now. I've been in the whole research communication space for 2 years now, after having been a managing editor for close to 7 years. I just have one question for Vasudhara. How might I control this presentation, or should I share my own screen, Vasudhara?
I think back-end folks are controlling that. So you
Shane,
Okay.
can say
if you just
change
let
and
me
give,
know when you
yeah.
want the slide to be changed, I'll change it for you.
Sure, no problem. Let me just check if it's possible. There you go. Yeah. So there's my introduction. Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time editing and reviewing manuscripts, and I continue to work as a managing editor. So I actually jumped out of research to help people publish, because I was more passionate about writing manuscripts than I was about actually, conducting research. I mean, I loved research. Trust me, there's no greater thrill than making a discovery that you can call your own and that pushes the boundary of human knowledge just that one little step further. But I did find myself kind of gravitating towards writing and editing research manuscripts when I was my first semester. And from there, I transitioned into like a full time role as an editor. And over the last 4 months alone, I've worked on, yeah, this number is not an exaggeration. I've seen over 2,800 such projects happen in the sphere of science communication. So then, my question to all of you is, what is effective research communication, right? And I can summarize the answer for this in 2 slides for everybody, and I will barely use any words, right? So do you remember this equation? And now how about this, right? So the moment, just so if you could just go back, sorry, right? So the moment you look at this picture, you know immediately about what I'm talking about, right? But if I show you this equation, right, some of us do scratch our heads for a little bit. Some of us go back to 12th standard physics to understand what this was. But the moment I show you this one singular image, right, this clearly tells you, right, what you need to know. And this is not something that Isaac Newton came up with, right? This was something that a science communicator, a woman based out of France, was able to do for him. She read his work and she interpreted it, and then she asked him about how he chanced upon the idea of this equation. And he explained the anecdote. And that's what we today know as how Isaac Newton discovered gravity, right? And this is a great way to summarize what great science communication essentially is. And why science communication is important? It's because we as a community, all right, we dedicate our lives to specializing in what we believe in, right? We focus on a research question and we dedicate almost half a decade to it in the search for answers. And that level of devotion and dedication often results in us perhaps talking a lot in terms of jargon. I just seem to be having a little bit of difficulty in switching slides. Just give me a second. Right? So we do undergo quite a bit of difficulty in being able to decipher jargon. Now, if you look at this paper, I'm quite certain that most of you on this talk right now are going to be able to identify what this paper is all about, right? Some of you will just glance at this and you will be able to very, very simply tell me that this has to do with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, right? That a lot of the European countries are currently debating using because of blood clot related issues. But if I was to take this paper and take it to anybody else, I would spend a considerable amount of time trying to decipher what this was all about. And that's because traditional science writing is often dry, it is stale, right? It is extremely indomitable and generally indecipherable. And I've seen this in real life. I have seen plain language summaries that researchers claim to write about their work, right? And it is completely chock a block full with things that they are completely familiar with all the time, right? You'll have sentences that are 3 lines in length, where when you start the sentence, by the time you get to the end of it, you've forgotten what the sentence at the beginning actually was even talking about, right? And what that does is that it prevents your discovery from reaching more than your sort of sphere of influence, which is in some cases your lab, your department, your institute, right? They are probably going to be the first people who are going to know about your publication, right? But as soon as you have published something, right, who else is going to find out about it apart from that circle? It's going to take, say, around 2 to 3 years before it starts to sort of get cited regularly. And that depends on, of course, the importance of the work itself, right? But the language in which we generally write science and the language in which we generally communicate our science, right, it makes it very difficult for that science to be discoverable outside the traditional route of publication, right? And if that's the case, and if it's only understandable by a group of experts, then have we done justice to the society who we eventually essentially serve? And the answer is is debatable, right? Because if you are working on a piece of research, and again it only has a limited amount of application, and the importance of that is not evident to a lot of people immediately, right? uh, it does become a challenge for the researcher moving forward. And I think another point essentially to talk about, right, is that in a lot of other geographies, essentially, that we are looking at, in a lot of other geographies, especially in the United Kingdom, some of you must have heard of the REF, or the Research Excellence Framework, that exists. Now, the Research Excellence Framework particularly dictates that scientists be able to clearly demonstrate the social impact of the research that they're carrying out in any field, right? And this has now become a requirement for them to receive a certain part of their funding. And which is why it's becoming increasingly important to be able to communicate science, and to be able to communicate science with a narrative that explains your science in a manner that where everybody can essentially absorb it. And yes, of course, I also understand the challenge that most researchers face, essentially, in that in the modern world, the rush to publish your scientific finding often sort of takes away from the storytelling of discovery, because why? You're under pressure, you're under a crunch to publish. And that often so-called robs you of the time and the nuance that's necessary to be able to communicate your science with a particular narrative. But have such narratives existed in the past? Well, if you ask me, of course they have. Right? These are the stories that sort of inspired us to get into the field of work that we are in currently right now. I, for one person, was fascinated by and was fascinated at a very young age to take up biology and then further on take up molecular biology. Why? Because I was completely fascinated by the reporting of work that was done by Francis Crick and Jim Watson when they discovered the DNA double helix. That was one seminal point in my life where I realized that this is what I wanted to study. And when you do communicate your science, it can tend to so-called get into these molds where you talk about the story of the discovery, or you look at the source of inspiration. You talk about how your discovery helps to solve a problem, or how it impacts people's lives, right? And of course, the whole quest aspect of where you started and where you are right now in the quest to discover something new, right? And of course, the final element in which science has been communicated to the masses in the past is the sci-fi fantasy, right? But these are the various modes. We can just go back to the previous slide. These are the various modes that science communication often takes when we take our science from a manuscript and so-called take it out of that manuscript and communicate it to a larger audience. So The narrative, of course, it exists because we need to present it in a non-traditional format. And this becomes important. This becomes important because, give me one second. Traditionally, science is only communicated in this fashion, right? There is your journal which reaches out to its readership, and this is what we essentially have, right? It's a single form of communication, it's one way, and there's limited engagement with the wider audience. And that in turn essentially makes for a limited so-called reach for your science, right? So you have your article that's published in a journal and the readership picks it up, your department picks it up, your institute picks it up, and the peer reviewers and of course the authors, the readership of the journal picks it up. But when you pick up enhanced content formats where you summarize it into a plain language summary, you convert it into a video, or you talk about it in the form of a podcast, right? You are able to increase the impact of the work that you are publishing, right? And that allows you to bring about the influencing of your peers and the public as well as policymakers who look at your science, right? And take that into account when it comes to their decision making, right? And this has never been more evident than now, right? Where we are in this third wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And there are various different ways in which government agencies all over the world are scrambling in more ways than one to first communicate what steps we need to take as a population to so-called protect ourselves from the virus, be it social distancing, be it the wearing of masks, be it the washing of our hands, right? All of this has now needed to be communicated in a sort of simplified manner. Right. Yeah. And what all of that means is that, I mean, especially when you look at the example of this now, right, just publishing your content traditionally in a target journal or in a specific journal is now no longer enough. And how do I know that? On what basis do I even say that? I say that to you because almost on a daily basis, right, I have the opportunity to speak to people from Elsevier, from Wiley. Of course, Nature doesn't speak to me because I'm one of their I work for a company that's one of their competitors, right? But all of them, all of them are now, all the journals, all the societies, everybody wants to come now, and everybody is talking about communicating what they've published in an alternate content, in an alternative so-called content format. That has become very, very critical. Because again, there are two aspects to this. One is because they, of course, want to keep their so-called submissions flowing. There is also an element of keeping submissions high for particular journals. They want authors to keep coming back, so they generally want and to give an author something along with just the publication, which is they'll try to give them an additional piece of content, which is an alternate content format, and I'll get into those, right? And the second thing, apart from getting authors to constantly come back to you, is that they want the science to now be more accessible. And this is literally a conversation that I've had with the New England Journal of Medicine, where now the movement is so-called sort of steering towards what we call open science. The one thing that a lot of us are trying to realize now is that the science we put out there is not very accessible. And if it is not very accessible, then it hinders a lot of the world's population from being able to understand it, from being able to apply it, and also sort of encouraging the future generations to come up and sort of take it up. And with that in mind, publishers are now starting to dabble. They want to get into social media. They want to be able to kind of put out alternate content formats. They want to put out their own podcasts. There are several such examples. Every publisher, every journal, every publisher is now trying to put out a podcast. Every academic society today is trying to put out a podcast. They're trying to put out videos because, again, it's important for them to increase their presence on social media, right? And that's where, again, That's another way in which it is driving the so-called boom for research communication, right? And of course, the reason as to why they want to do it is because, like I said, they want to attract submissions, they want to improve engagement with authors, they want to continue to build brand value. And then, of course, there's altmetric. All of you know about impact factor, right? That's something we all know about. But impact factor is something that you find out about the journal maybe 2 3 years after your paper has been published. You realize then that the impact factor may have increased, right? But altmetric is a real-time bibliographic metric which tells you about the number of instances where your manuscript has been cited by somebody. Is someone talking about it? Is someone tweeting about it? This has now become a very critical metric along with the publication as well, right? So a lot of people now actively track altmetric. It tells you about the social media mentions that your paper has received. And a lot of publishers tend to depend on this very, very heavily. So, right, and altmetric is affected by the number of people who talk about a paper, and altmetric is improved by the presence of alternate content formats, right? And what are these alternate content formats that I keep talking to you guys about time and time again, right? These are the alternate kind of content formats I'm talking to you about. Infographics that the Royal Society of Chemistry now uses, stuff that's used by the Clinical Orthopedics and Society, as well as the Pain Journal. These are all examples of how research can be converted into a format that a larger so-called mass audience can look into and absorb. And of course, beyond that, the more impactful so-called medium is now the animated video summary, where you essentially summarize the findings of your paper in an animated format, essentially. But how can you as a researcher start to do this? How can you as a researcher start to do this? Now, we of course live in an era where social media permeates almost every aspect of our lives. My suggestion to you as a researcher, and it'll take a bit of time getting used to, but invest in creating at least one social media account, right, which is dedicated towards talking about your research. It could be an alternative account on LinkedIn. It could be an alternate Twitter handle that you might have. It could be an alternative Instagram handle that you have, where you can constantly talk about your research. You can put up a picture of yourself presenting at a particular conference. The key here is to increase your presence online. At least start there. And that's how you can boost the manner in which your research is picked up or talked about. Post about your research. You know, get into the habit of summarizing your research, or get into the habit of explaining your research or summarizing it in a manner where you can tell it to more people. Maintain things like a blog as a researcher. These are some of the things that you can do to start with. I heard quite a few of you asking Sarah about, what sort of, courses can I take up? What's available to me? Before you get to that, of course, there are those online resources, but the first step starts with you being able to getting into the habit of writing yourself about your research in non-technical terms, essentially. That becomes really, really critical.
Shane, if I
Yes,
may ask
Vasudha.
you, like in 2 minutes, we have some
Yes,
interesting questions. Yeah,
sure, sure. I will be wrapping up very soon. All right.
thanks.
Again, how can you as a researcher benefit from social media? If you do maintain a social media account only for your research, only to talk about your research, then it can help improve all your paper's altmetrics. I've seen a lot of my friends do this now recently, where if they've published something, they actually put up a post on Facebook and link the DOI. So that if somebody clicks on that DOI and reads about the paper from Facebook, then the altmetric score tends to increase. And being able to blog about your research is also important, right? So if all of you are in the habit of maintaining lab books or log books in which you sort of note down protocol, maybe maintain another book to just compose your thoughts and talk about what you found and how that helps you. Tie your own personal journey into what you discover as a researcher, because people who are successful in this field tend to do that. And a good example of that is this page of a Nobel laureate, Dr. Shinya Yamanaka, whose work I've had the pleasure of looking at and even helping improve to some extent. Now, of course, there are agencies that do this, and I think a lot of foreign universities have the budget with the press office to help researchers do this and put themselves out there. But at least you as a researcher, I mean, if you're thinking about being on social media to talk about other things, do invest your time talking about the work that you do. Because in my opinion, when I look at it from a content perspective, that's the best kind of content that you can have out there as a researcher. And of course, the other alternate content formats, be it infographics, be it video summaries, be it anything else, that will come along as you sort of go along. So there we go. Like I said, this paradigm is shifting in the United Kingdom, and this change is coming about. We don't know when it's going to happen in India in all earnest, but yeah, uh, it's something that is happening all over the world. So yeah, just to summarize very, very quickly, what does all this mean? It's more important than ever to communicate your research effectively and innovatively so that people understand what you're talking about as a researcher, right? So yeah, this is some feedback that we've gotten from quite a few people in Japan who we work with and help so-called convert their research into alternate research formats. So yeah, there we are. So thank you for that, and I will now take your questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shane. I think from both Sarah's talk and your talk, we can really take a good message how important effective communication is. And that as scientists, we should not restrict with just publishing, but reach out to community and be able to discuss science in a very free flow manner. In fact, couple of questions are, I would say, directed in that direction. Like, Arshdeep Sidhu asks, how can science communication in general be improved in vernacular language for broadcasting public outreach, or in terms of how can we improve it in a local level is the question.
So it honestly comes down to not seeing your scientific research as its own silo, as a completely different thing. I think a lot of the times, and this is a very difficult question or a difficult obstacle for a lot of researchers to overcome, because you always see this as a particular silo in your life where nothing else can permeate. Once you enter a lab and you put your lab coat on and you start your day, that's it. Everything else tends to fade away, right? The key is to start linking what you do every day in the lab back into the life that you have outside, right? Again, I keep saying this. If you can talk about what happens on a weekend with your friends on social media, then you should have the ability to talk about what happened with your cultures. I know there are so many social media handles in the West that do this in a funny manner. Everybody's heard of PhD comics, right? Everybody has spent some time reading PhD comics, right? How did she start?
That's
She just
right.
one day decided that what she was going through in the lab, it was funny enough to document, right? And that's how she is. But what you're not realizing is that she managed, with that change, she managed to bring so many of our obstacles as people who are pursuing PhDs or postdocs. She managed to put all of that out there on social media. So she helped with that. Another good place to start is go to the right resources and see what's happening in the publication industry. Science won't be anywhere without the publication industry. So you should be going, you should be reading, you should be checking out things like the scholarly kitchen, right? See what they write about. Look at what the most latest trends are in the industry, right? Come back and then connect that to what's happening around you, sort of locally, right? This was a very interesting sort of tagline they gave me when I was in college and I was organizing a fest. They said, think global but act local. So think about what's happening around you, right, and then apply it to what you have in and around you. A good example of that is a lot of people now are taking time, right, to explain to the people around them in their circles as to why getting a vaccination is a good idea and we have nothing to worry about. How are we doing that?
That's right.
How are we doing that? We're doing
That's
that
right.
because we're in a crisis, right? We're doing that in a crisis. I, day before yesterday, spoke to a bunch of family members and said, 90% is more than we would have ever gotten in another time, right? And we should just go ahead and take it. So that's how you think about it. Think about it locally within your own context and follow what's happening globally in terms of science communication and publication.
Right. So Lasya Samhita has one question. This is also quite interesting. Do you have a practical suggestion, a quick practical suggestion for how to make our science communication a two-way process?
So how to make your science communication two-way process? Okay, a quick suggestion. And so when you say a two-way process, do you mean to say that you want to communicate it to somebody and then do you want like people to engage with you in your science? Is that what you're talking about? We don't know. Okay.
Yeah.
So I can give you a good example of making it a two-way process. One of the things I've suggested to quite a few people is, why don't you consider having a lab podcast? Why don't you consider having a lab podcast where you and somebody else in your lab or maybe your institute get together to talk about what's happening? Don't go into granular details, of course, for various reasons. Don't go into granular details, but spend some time, do a lab podcast. It's a great way to engage with your community in and around in your campus, right? They'll have their very own show to listen to and find out what's happening, right? And it will make what they're doing seem more important. So that's one way of starting it. Think about starting a podcast. Another thing is to have a blog where people can leave comments and thoughts on what you're writing about day in, day out. That's another way to have like a two-way so-called communication when it comes to your science communication. And remember, and remember that it's going to be difficult at first. It's not going to be great. So
Yeah.
you're going to have to be brave to go past those first 5 episodes, those first 5 posts, those first five
That's right.
blogs. You have to be brave to go past that. I did that, right? I was brave enough to go past that for many, many years. And I persisted, even though I'm like, I don't know where, there's nothing in India for science communication, right? But yet we persist. We persist, and today we see that, all these possibilities are there. And I'm here talking to you. So you have to persist beyond those first five.
Cross boundaries.
Yeah.
I think it's better than 10 years ago. You're right.
It
So we
is.
have,
It is.
yeah. We have Dhaval Patel who would like to ask a question. Dhaval? Hello, Dhaval. Are you there?
Hi, sorry, I'm here.
Yeah, we
Um,
can hear you.
so my question for Shane is like, personally being a not so active social media user, I sometimes feel that, having that visual presence or having more followers or having more likes about whatever kind of work you are doing on social media, it could also have certain negative impact on your perspective. And how do you integrate your message, keeping this negative effect of social media?
So I think, Dhaval, there, when I say maintain an account for your social media and research, you have to run it like a professional. All these people who run social media accounts, right? I don't know what people's interests are in terms of following people on social media. One thing I have learned working in social media for researchers, one of the things we help publishers do is maintain their social media, their messaging, right? I can tell you 100% that how do we regulate it? It's because we make a plan, right? You don't just put everything that happens to you on social media, you plan. For example, I'll give you an example. Today, like I said, I've spoken to all of you at YIM 2021, right? That is something I'm going to talk about on social media, right? I presented at a conference, I'm going to talk about that. I published a paper, I'm going to talk about that. But I'm not necessarily going to talk about every little detail. I'm going to plan it. I'm going to give it a quota in my life so that it doesn't completely absorb me. So, like with everything else with social media, it's important to maintain like a schedule or a calendar for using it for this purpose. That is the next step. So, if you decide to do that, you tell yourself that in a month, I'm going to post 4 times, or I'm going to post 3 times. This is what I'm going to post about. Maybe I will at the start of the month post about something I'm doing, and then throughout the month I'm going to talk about something else that's philosophical. It doesn't necessarily need to so-called talk about specifically my science itself. So the key is to the key is to have that conversation, not only because to improve your presence online. It's not just about improving your presence online, but it's also to improve your ability to engage with more people when they reach out to you, when they ask you questions, right? So that's what you do. You plan it, you create a schedule, you create a calendar around it, and then you do it. And that prevents it from impacting you negatively. It prevents it from so-called taking over your life in any way or making you worry about any negative impacts that social media might have.